Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Science on Tap Online. My name is Amanda Thomas, and I will be your host this evening. And we are so glad that you are here. We are going to be talking about the out how humans and matter transformed one another with Dr. Ainissa Ramirez, who is a material scientist and an author of this fascinating book. I had the opportunity to talk to her a couple of weeks ago and do a short interview with her in advance of this event. And I don't know if you are aware, but we have a podcast. It's called A Scientist Walks into a Bar. And if you are interested in hearing a little bit more, or possibly you've already listened to this episode, or if you want to hear, we've got many other episodes. I encourage you to check out. You can search for A Scientist Walks into a Bar with any of your favorite podcast apps, and you can hear the interview with Aneesa and a bunch of other things. So, um, welcome, as I said. We do Science on Tap. We've been doing it here online for the past several weeks. But those of you who have not been to one of our live events, just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of what we do. We have been running Science on Tap in Portland, Oregon and Vancouver, Washington for the past 7 years or more. We have a couple different locations that we work in, and they're all lovely theaters where you can go and get an adult beverage, perhaps, or some food, and sit in the theater and listen to a scientist share her expertise on whatever topic. We've done everything. This is Dr. Kaylee Swift and the picture who's talking about crows, but we've done neuroscience and music and all sorts of different things. So we have a bunch of different exciting topics coming up in the next few weeks. So I encourage you to check back with us, check our Facebook page, and we'll be sending out information about some of the cool topics that we have coming up in the near future. Our goal is to make science accessible to as many people as possible, especially adults. I think it's really important for adults to be well educated in at least how science works, maybe not the specifics of a particular science, but just to know like what the scientific process is. Because adults vote and buy things, and it's important that people be scientifically literate these days. So we hope, we're glad you're here, but we want you to enjoy your evening. So perhaps get a beverage. I have a blackberry lemonade, I think, here in my Science on Tap pint glass. If you have a beverage of choice, alcoholic or otherwise, please enjoy that while you are watching the presentation this evening. And we will be recording this event. It will be online on Facebook and YouTube tomorrow. We will only be leaving this recording up for about a week, though. So I encourage you, if you want to take a look at it or you want to share it with a friend, please do that within the next couple of days. What you can expect this evening, we've already started. Aneesa is going to talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for Q&A afterward. So if you have questions, please write them in either the chat on Zoom, the chat or the Q&A on Zoom. We have people watching those, or in the thread on Facebook, and we'll have people, they will be sending me those questions, and then I will come on screen and ask those of Aneesa at the end of the presentation. So we'll try and get to as many questions as we can. And then we should be ending around 8 or so, give or take. And yeah, Aneesa's over on the East Coast, so we don't want to keep her too late. Couple things. We've gotten some feedback from people who are on Zoom who have complained about the prevalence of the chat window and how it was annoying. And so if you are on Zoom, if you're on Facebook, you can ignore this part for right now. But if you're on Zoom, at the very bottom, there's the little chat. There's where I have the handy arrow pointing. If you click on that, I believe it should open a window where the chat will pop out and be its own separate window. I'm pretty sure if you take that and you scoot it over off of the screen, it will not flash every time a new comment comes up. So if the chat is irritating to you, feel free to do that, and hopefully that will be less distracting. Also, and another thing is, I wanted to mention about Zoom in general, and this is something that you may not be aware of just at all, but we have to pay for participants to pay to come in Zoom, and so we have a number of seats that are spots that we pay for, and then when those seats or spots when people pre-register for those spots, once we hit the maximum, we can't let anybody else in, which is great because if we have a lot of people interested and have a full house, that's fabulous. The problem comes when people who pre-register and they can't join us for whatever reason, and that's fine. We realize that lives happen, and so what happens is if you don't cancel your registration, then you are taking the spot of somebody else. So that spot is empty. So if you do pre-register, which we encourage you to do, and if for some reason you're unable to join us, which is again totally fine, we just ask that you cancel your registration. It should just be a couple of clicks away to do that. So that opens up the spot for somebody else. And I'm gonna wager that this is the same if you are participating in any other webinars on Zoom. So be aware of that when you are signing up for things. I have a little arrow at the bottom that shows, there's please cancel there. Also in the email confirmation you should have gotten, if you pre-registered it, there will be a cancel link there as well. And speaking of which, whoops, wrong direction. As I mentioned, we have to pay for Zoom and we have other expenses, and we could sure use your support. And we want to keep these events and our podcasts free and available to as many people as possible. But we can only do that with your support. So if you can, if you're in a position to do so, we would be greatly appreciative of any kind of donation, doesn't matter the amount. We've had some very generous donations, and I want to thank the people who have already donated. You can go to our nonprofit partner, makeyouthink.org/support, and make a donation there, or you can join us on Patreon, and we have some cool prizes and gifts to give away on Patreon as well. Okay, so with that, I am going to turn my screen off, and I am going to welcome our speaker for the evening, Dr. Aneesa Ramirez.
Hey there, everyone. All right. Well, I want to say thank you so much to the organizers. I'm so delighted to be here to be able to share with you my new book, The Alchemy of Us, How Humans and Matter Transform One Another. This book examines how technology shaped us. Now, in the time that we're together, let me just provide a little bit of a roadmap. I want to talk to you a little bit about the origin story of the book, tell you my vantage, what was my point of view in writing it. And then we'll take a deep dive into different ways of how technology shaped us. Okay, so as for my vantage, I'm a material scientist. Most people don't know what that is. I liken material science to my home state of New Jersey because both New Jersey and material science have been overshadowed by their neighbors. For New Jersey, that's Philadelphia and New York, and for material science, that's chemistry and physics. Material science sits at where chemistry and physics overlaps. It's interested in how atoms bond, and so that's the chemistry part, and then how those bonds translate into how a material behaves in certain situations. And so that's the physics part. Now, to be honest, the first time I heard about material science, I didn't think much of it because I was an undergrad and it was a prerequisite course, which I had translated into boring. However, my professor said something that really blew me away on the first day. He said, the reason why we don't fall through the floor, and the reason why my sweater is the color that it is, and the reason why the lights work, all has to do with the interaction of atoms. And if you can understand how they do that, you can get them to do new things. Now, when he said this was completely blowing me away. In fact, I stopped listening to him, which I don't recommend. You should always listen to your professor. But I started looking at things in the lecture hall in a new way. Like the pencil in my hand. It was able to make a mark because the carbon atom slid past each other. And my shoes, they were comfortable because the molecules are kind of shaped like springs, which brought a comfort to my feet. And my glasses helped my eyes see because they bent light to my distant retinas. All this was because of atoms. This guy was telling me something that made the whole world make sense to me. And it was that moment that I decided that I wanted to be a material scientist. Now, I had known I had wanted to be a scientist. I had known that since I was very, very young. I was one of those kids since I was 4, I wanted to be a scientist. I asked questions like, why is the sky blue? Why do leaves change color? And what really put me on the road to becoming a scientist were actually television shows in the late 70s and 80s. I loved shows like Star Trek, The $6 Million Man, and The Bionic Woman. But the show that really put me on my path was a small PBS television show called 3-2-1 Contact. And in it, there was a segment of a little African-American girl solving problems. And when I saw her, I saw my reflection. So it was that instance when I decided I wanted to be a scientist, but it was a decade and a half later where I knew I wanted to be a material scientist. And that's what you have in front of you today. Now, I've been a material scientist for some time. And it was a couple of years ago that I decided that I wanted to do something new, just to mix it up a little bit in this world of materials. And in doing so, this is where the book came to me. A couple of years ago, I took a couple of glassblowing classes just to check it off my bucket list. And I was so thrilled to take this class because when I went to visit, I saw the instructor do something that was amazing. He got a clear lump of glass and he pulled it a couple of times and he made a galloping horse. It was absolutely beautiful. I said, I want to be around this guy. But I have to say that when I signed up for classes, I was also very, very scared because when I came to visit, he said, well, don't step on any glass, even if you think it's cool, because it's going to burn a hole in your shoe. Burn a hole in my shoe? What kind of operation is this? Does OSHA know about this? I knew that this glass class was going to be fun, but I had to be cautious because, well, to be honest, I come from a long line of people who are very, very clumsy, and I knew that there was going to be harm, and if anyone was going to get hurt, it was going to be me. So I signed up for a few classes, and because of this information about possibly being hurt, I took a very, very cautious approach. So when it was my turn to work with the glass, what I usually did is I would get my pipe, and I would put it gingerly into the vat of glass, and then I would just pull out a little bit, and I would blow a very, very small bubble and make a small vase. And the vase would be about as big as my hand. And I had, I don't know, dozens and dozens of vases made that way. And I would give them to friends, and friends would accept them even though I knew they were lopsided. But they always encouraged me, and they would say, hey, Aneesa, you should make something bigger. And I would say, oh, no. Oh, no, 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 no. Do you know how hard it is to do glass blowing and not get burned? Small vases is what I'm going to do from here on out. Now, it ends up that there was one day that I went to my glassblowing class where I didn't care to be so safe. You see, what happened is that there were a lot of layoffs at work. There was a lot of crying, a lot of hugging. As you can imagine, when I got to my glassblowing class that night, I was pretty raw. So I didn't take the same approach as I had usually done. This time, when I went to my glassblowing class, I got the pipe and I would put it deep into that vat of glass. And I pulled out a lot of glass, nearly maxing out my muscles. And I blew a huge bubble, huge. And then I did things I hadn't done before, which is I swung the glass. And when I swung it, it made the glass longer. And then I spun the glass. And when I did that, it made the glass wider. As I came back to myself, I realized that this glass piece was the best piece I had ever made. And my colleagues in the class were saying, hey, Aneesa, that's a really great piece. And I would be working on it. And I'm like, I know, this is pretty amazing. I can't believe I made this piece. This is not a small vase. This is actually beautiful. Now, I had one more step. All I had to do was put the piece into the furnace for a flash of heat, and then take it out so I can remove it from the pipe and then put it into the area where it got cool. But as I put it into the furnace, I was still talking to my friend and still talking and so excited about this piece that it stayed in there too long. When I pulled it out, the glass piece, which had been parallel to the pipe, was now hanging off the pipe like this, and it was now incandescent orange. I was kind of in trouble. Well, I had a little bit of knowledge. I knew that all I had to do was turn this pipe over, and if I did, the pipe would then right itself. But because it was so hot, it just kept going back to this new lower side. And so I kept rotating it, and it would still return to this new lower side. I did this a couple of times because, frankly, I didn't really know what to do. And I was hoping that the glass would eventually cool off, but it didn't. So in another attempt, I rotated it one more time and the glass completely fell off and fell onto the floor. Boom, there it was, my beautiful glass piece, now flattened on one side. Now my instructor had been watching what was going on, so he ran over with asbestos gloves. He got the piece, reattached to my pipe, put it into the furnace, took it out, opened up the mouth that had been flattened because it had collapsed on itself. And then he gave it to me and I tried to round the flattened side. It didn't look the same at all. And I finally did what I should have done before, which was put that glass piece into the furnace, pull it out for that short amount of time where I could remove it and then put it over to the area where it should be cooled. Now, as it was cooling and as I was calming down from that scary event, I started thinking. I was shaping the glass, but it was actually shaping me. I started that day in a very, very bad mood, and now I wasn't really in such a bad mood anymore. Now, this is a bit existential, but it was that moment where I began to think about how materials and humans transform one another. This was the birth of the book. This was the birth of the Alchemy of Us, how humans transform one another. So that put me on a journey to explore how materials have made it to where we are today. Now, that's the origin story of the book, but let me share with you a little bit of what it looks like to make the book. I had to really take a different point of view. See, as a material scientist working in a research laboratory, I was so focused on the future. I wanted to make something stronger, better, faster, just like the $6 million man. And I was also, you can think of it as if I was a periscope and I was pointing in the direction that I was going towards the future. But now, in order to do this work to explore how materials got us to here, I actually had to think about the past. And that periscope had to change its direction, so I would look towards the past to see how things got us to here. I also had to change locations. Before, I used to work in a laboratory in clean rooms, wear clean room suits, put on special gloves, and then look through a microscope and look for something new. Now, I had to go to archives and look at dusty and old materials, old papers, and again, but I was still on the hunt for looking for something new. Let me share with you what a very, very good day looks like at the archives. An average day kind of looks the same, which is I'm looking at a book, I'm turning some pages and writing some notes. That's not going to make a movie. But let me share with you what a great day looks like. Now, as I was writing The Alchemy of Us, the first chapter, I wanted to talk about how the evolution of clocks actually changed culture. And it was made possible by the materials that were inside. Now, I had already found how materials changed us, particularly in timekeeping. I found that the way that we used to sleep was different before clocks were prominent. Before the Industrial Revolution, we used to sleep differently. We used to sleep in two separate intervals. We would sleep for about 3.5 hours, wake up for about an hour, and then go back to sleep and sleep for about 3.5 hours. And these two segments of sleep were called first and second sleep. And everybody slept that way. And what changed that? Well, actually, it was a 1-2 punch. It was the clock. We had to go to the factory at a certain time, so the second sleep became truncated. And also, the second contribution was artificial lights. We went to bed later, and so the first segment was truncated. And these two segments, because they became truncated, it didn't make sense to sleep for such a short amount of time. They overlapped, and so it looks more like the sleep that we had today. So the clock, along with artificial lights, changed how we sleep. So that was one of the things that I talk about in The Alchemy of Us. But what I was also looking for while I was writing the book was a way to show readers how we became obsessed with time. And I hadn't been finding anything. So I'm reading these books, opening them up, not finding anything. This is sort of the pattern. One day I find something amazing. In a very, very thick book, I see one sentence. It says, in the 19th century, there was a woman in England who sold time. I said, what? And I said it loudly like that. And I'm in a library, and everyone who's looking in their book looks up to see who's made that noise. And because I didn't want anybody to know that it was me, I also do the same gesture. Shh, be quiet, just so that they don't know it's me. But I say to myself, what? there was a woman who sold time. Explain yourself. What is that? Now, just in the past, when I worked in research, I would look at data points, and if I saw one data point that was different from the trend, I would investigate that. It was similar to what was going on in the archives. Here I found one sentence in a book, and I went to investigate that. This is what I found. In the 19th century, there was a woman named Ruth Belville who had an extraordinary business. She was in the business of selling time. She would wake up early on a Monday morning and leave her home in Maidenhead, which was about 30 miles outside of London, make her way over to London, and then make her way over to Greenwich, and then up a very, very steep hill to the Royal Observatory where the precise time was held. And the whole time she was carrying with her one of these, pocket watch. She had a pocket watch that she nicknamed Arnold. Now, what she would do is she would pass her pocket watch over to the attendant, and the attendant would look at her watch and compare it to their scientific clock. And then they would give her a certificate stating what the difference is in time. Then she'd make her way down the hill, she would cross the Thames, go over to London, and then walk over to various businesses that needed to know it. She would give her watch over to the folks at the newspaper, and the newspaper would look at her watch, and then they would fix the watch in their offices. She would go to businesses, and she would go to the London docks and give it to navigators so they were able to determine longitude. Ruth Belville had been in the business of selling time for all of her life, and her family had been in the business for over 100 years. Ruth was called the Greenwich Time Lady. Now, when I found this, this was fantastic. A woman who sold time, this is just so fascinating. As a person who was writing the book, I found a great way to show how obsessed we became with time, because someone could have a business selling it. If I told you today that I was going to sell time, you would look at me and say, that's a bad idea. You're right, because we already live in a world where time is part of our lives. But in Ruth's day, it was just weaving into the culture as we know it today. And so I thought she was fantastic. She was also a fantastic device to show the importance of time. So when I found Ruth, I was so excited. But I have to say that the next set of emotions that I had were also, I was a little sad, and I was also a little mad. How is it that a woman with such a fascinating job can be reduced to one sentence in a dusty book that I was committed to reading, but most people wouldn't? That didn't seem right to me. And so actually, Ruth actually changed the book. Just as that glass blowing accident shifted the direction of my periscope from going to the forward to the back, Ruth told me to change the focus to kind of highlight those little known scientists. And that's one of the advantages that I take while writing the book, The Alchemy of Us. Okay, so we've looked and I've explained a little bit about the origin story of the book. And I've also shared with you my vantage. Let me share with you some of the things I learned in how technology shaped us. And I want to just go over a couple of case studies. I want to show how technology can lead to surprises, how sometimes there can be unintended consequences, and also how technology can go awry. Okay, so for surprises, if we want to explore surprises, one technology that underscores that is the telegraph. In The Alchemy of Us, I look at older technologies to show how they've made us to today. Now, the telegraph was developed by Samuel F.B. Morse. Now, Samuel Morse would have loved to have had a telegraph earlier in his life. You may not know this, but Samuel Morse was actually a painter, and he had the biggest commission of his life. He had been asked to paint a portrait of a French commander who was visiting, and he was in Washington, D.C. And Morse lived in New Haven. And this was a fantastic opportunity. This was going to be the moment where he was going to rise and do great things. He was so excited about this. And he would write letters home because that was the fastest way to communicate at the time. And so he would write letters home, and he would tell his wife about all the wonderful things he was doing, all the parties he was going to in Washington, D.C. And in one of his letters, he ended it with, "I long to hear from you." And he mailed that letter, and he knew it was going to take a couple of days to get to his wife because it went by stagecoach. And after she wrote, it was going to take a couple of days to get back to him. So in a week and a half to 2 weeks, he was going to hear back. That was the fastest means of communication at the time. So he writes this letter and he mails it. About 3 days later, he gets a letter from home from New Haven. It's from his father. His father was very stern, very puritanical. And he starts the letter with, my affectionately beloved son. And Morse is like, okay, what's up? So as he reads the letter, he finds out that his wife had died. The moment that he was writing a letter to his wife, telling her that he longs to hear from you, that he longed to hear from her, she had already passed away. So he rushed back to New Haven, and that took a couple of days. When he got there, she had already been buried. So you can imagine that he was well primed to be the inventor of the telegraph. Although he was a painter, he had the passion and the desire to invent a way to communicate very rapidly. So he began to develop his telegraph with his assistant, Alfred Vail. And they were sometimes in different locations, and they started to send dots and dashes, that is long and short electrical pulses, using their telegraph to each other to communicate. And they would do various experiments, and they would write to each other about how each experiment went. Oh, this worked out well, let's do this. Oh, that didn't work out well. That's the exchanges that they had. Now, in his letters to Alfred Vail, Morse started getting a little annoyed. Morse kind of had a short temper. He would say to Vail, "Condense your language." See, that was kind of how they spoke back then. He was telling Vail to reduce things in the message that don't contribute to the meaning of the message. Both Vail and Morse were very, very loquacious. They came from the tradition of writing long letters. So they would write the letters, and then they would translate each letter of the word into dots and dashes, and then they would transmit those dots and dashes, and then the person on the other end would get those dots and dashes and then convert those to letters. You can see this takes some time. Morse was getting frustrated because he was tired of translating something like dash, 4 dots, dot, 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 and then another dot, dot, and realizing that it was T-H-E, the. That's a lot of work for a word that doesn't do very much. So that's why he was chiding Vail to condense your language. Only put things in the message that's going to contribute to the meaning. Leave out the, and. For understanding, just use UN, and for B, instead of BE, just use B. See, they started to have a shorthand, just like we have with Twitter and with text messages. So Morse told Vail to condense your language. Now, the telegraph soon became part of the American fabric. And telegraph officers would tell customers, hey, we're happy to send a message to you long distances, but we've got one rule. You've got to be brief. Now, the reason why that is that the telegraph could shuttle information back and forth, but it had a limitation. It could only shuttle so many messages at a time. And the telegraph offices wanted to make sure that the lines were free so that other customers could send their messages. You can think of it as a store with one checkout. The manager will say, look, you can check out, but you can only have 7 items. You can't come with a huge cart because there's other people behind you. This was the same kind of thinking at the telegraph offices. They were like 10 words, maybe 10 words had a certain rate, and if you wanted to have an additional word, that was 1/10 the fee. This was a way to encourage people to keep their messages very brief. Now, telegraphs actually became common in newspaper offices, and editors would tell their reporters to be succinct. Similarly, news was going across the country via the telegraph, and it had to be shortened because once again, there was a limitation for how much the telegraph could hold. Now, there was one reporter who really loved this style of writing with short declarative sentences. We know him today because he's the author, Ernest Hemingway. So you can see that the telegraph designed by Morse was a design to send messages very, very rapidly. But because of its limitation, it actually started to fashion American English along the way. Now, there were other factors that modified American English. One of them is that America wanted to individuate itself from the UK, and so we did this by the way that we use language. But another was a technology, and that technology was the telegraph. So you can see here how I describe how technology can give rise to surprising outcomes. And this is one of the things I describe in The Alchemy of Us. Let's also explore how technology can give rise to unintended consequences. And a good case study for that is the light bulb. Now, when you look at American textbooks or any kind of book about the technology of the light bulb, you're going to see Thomas Edison as the inventor. Look, that's not 100% true. Thomas Edison was not the first person to invent the light bulb. There are many inventors that predate him, like Joseph Swan in England. However, that said, let's explore Edison's work because I want to impress upon you why he took the approach he did. And more importantly, I want to share with you what was the impact of his work. Now, again, if you were to go back and look at those textbooks about Edison, they write about Edison in the way that he just had this inspiration and came up with this idea for the electric light. That's not true. That's not true at all. He actually was inspired because he made a visit to a little known scientist in Connecticut whose name was William Wallace. He's one of those hidden inventors that I highlight in the Alchemy of Us. Now, William Wallace was in charge of a brass manufacturer, but he did a lot of inventions in his home. And he had created an electric light that Edison had heard about, and he came to Connecticut to check out. I want to share with you what that image, arc light looked like. So my colleagues who are doing the screen share are going to share with you what the picture looked like of Wallace's arc light. Now, the reason why I'm sharing this to you, you're like looking at this contraption and you're like, what's the big whoop? First off, I'm so excited to share this with you because I found this in an attic in Connecticut. It's from 1878, and it was William Wallace's electric lamp. And you can see those dashed boxes at the bottom. That's where we had carbon blocks. And so he connected this to a huge circuit to a generator that he had created. And when he turned on the generator, electricity went between those two blocks and generated a huge bolt of lightning, which generated the light. This was William Wallace's arc lamp. Thank you so much for sharing this slide. Now, when Edison saw this, he was excited. He was like the proverbial moth to the flame. He's like, this is fantastic. I wasn't even thinking about doing electric lights, and now I am. So as he was leaving Wallace's home, he congratulated him. He ordered a couple of the things. He's like, I want one of those electric lights. I want that generator. Oh, and by the way, I think you're doing it wrong. I'm going to go and I'm going to beat you. Edison actually said this. And so that's what he did. He went back to New Jersey to work on his approach of his electric lights. Now, Wallace had made a great first step of creating his arc lamp, but there were some limitations, meaning that it was just too bright to be useful in the home. It could not be dimmed, or as Edison would say, it could not be subdivided. And so Edison needed to figure out another approach. And the approach that he was going to take was the incandescent bulb that we know today. He wanted to have a small wire, have electricity go through it that heated it up and caused it to glow. That was going to be his approach, because that is dimmable. Now, Edison was looking at different materials to choose for that filament wire. And he eventually settled on platinum. Now, platinum, from material science point of view, was a very, very good choice. You might know platinum. People have it as wedding rings, and it's in a lot of medical devices. Platinum is a material that doesn't melt at low temperatures. It's a high melting material. And that is a perfect candidate for a material that you want to have as a filament. Because if you're going to heat something up to very high temperatures, you don't want it to melt because that will take away the light. So that was a good choice from Edison. Good job. The other reason why platinum was a good idea is that platinum doesn't react with a lot of things. So if you have a metal or a material heating up to really, really high temperatures and it's next to oxygen, well, you're not going to form a soot on that surface, and that soot will dim the light. So that was also a good choice. So Edison did a great job in selecting platinum. So he created a lot of different circuits with his platinum filament. But I have to say, my friends, he couldn't get platinum to glow brightly. And it had nothing to do with his genius or with the circuits. It actually had to do with platinum itself. Platinum is a conductive metal, and what he needed was a resistive metal. In order to understand that, let's just compare a wire to a pipe. Now, if the pipe is empty, it's very easy for water to go through. Similarly, with the wire, it's very easy for electrons to move through it. If a pipe has marbles and pebbles through it, water has a more difficult time passing through. Well, this is what Edison needed. He needed a material where electrons would have a harder time going through, colliding with atoms and with surfaces and with grain boundaries. And when that happened, it would generate heat and then cause the glow. Platinum didn't do that. So what Edison actually needed to do was change the material. He eventually changed from platinum to carbon, which he found in a copper thread. And that's when he created his early electric light. I'm going to have my friend also share a picture of what his early electric light looked like. This material, on a very, very still night, all of his workers were together working on various types of electric lights. And it was this light that glowed for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and then eventually 40 hours until it eventually went dim. That was the birth of the electric lights. So that's how Edison came up with his idea for electric lights. Thank you so much for the picture. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's how Edison came up with his idea for the electric lights. Great. Let's explore how those electric lights, the abundance of lights, changed us. Again, this is about how we created technology and how this technology changed us. Well, in order to understand that, I have to take you back a couple of decades to a childhood tradition that we used to do in New Jersey. As the sun set on a summer evening, I would stand in my backyard and I would look into my backyard and I would wait. I would wait for these little sparks of light to show up. These, my friends, are called fireflies. And what I would do is, as soon as I saw one, I would run into the house, grab a mason jar that I had already prepared because it had holes in the top, run back out to the backyard, to my backyard, and try and capture one of these bits of nature's magic. I love fireflies. So much so, I want to show you a picture of what fireflies look like in all of their glory. Now, this is not my backyard, but this is in a place where you can go and visit and see fireflies. So I'm going to ask my colleagues to share the next slide. Here's a beautiful picture of fireflies, a time-lapse picture so you can see fireflies in all of their glory. Now, it ends up that fireflies are pretty common, and there are actually a few in my backyard. And I've learned by talking to some experts, actually, that the number of fireflies has been decreasing. The reason is, it's because of the lights. Thank you so much for sharing this slide with everyone. Let me explain to you what was going on in my backyard that I didn't know about. Okay, so the firefly communicates with these Morse codes of flashes, and they're in the they're interested because they're trying to find each other and find a mate. Now, let me explain what's going on in my backyard. There's a female firefly who's on a blade of grass, and the male firefly is flying about waist high, and he announces himself. He says, "I'm a male, I'm a photonous green eye. I'm a male, I'm a photonous green eye." And the female firefly who's on a blade of grass, she will look up, and if she likes what she sees, which is about 50% of the time, she'll flash back, "I like you," and the male firefly will drop like a rock to her vicinity, make his way over to her, and, well, future fireflies. That's all we need to say about that. But let me share what's going on now that we have a new entity in that scenario. We have the female firefly on a blade of grass, male firefly flying about waist high, and now we have a street lamp. What's going on now? Well, the male firefly will enter my backyard and announce himself. "I'm a male, I'm a photonous green eye. I'm a male, I'm a photonous green eye." The female firefly will look up. "Is anybody there?" You see, she can't see him because the light is so bright that it completely washes him out. No future fireflies. Let's do the scenario one more time. Female firefly on a blade of grass, male firefly about waist high, and again, that pesky old street lamp. Male firefly will announce himself. "I'm a male, I'm a photonous green eye. I'm a male, I'm a photonous green eye." Female fire looks up. She does see him this time. But she's not happy about what she sees. See, female fireflies like male fireflies with bright lanterns, and his lantern isn't looking so bright. Not with that street light behind him. So she doesn't flash back. No future fireflies. So that scenario is pretty sad, and that's a result of the overabundance of lights. But fireflies are not the only species who are being impacted by the lights. We are. Oh yeah, we are. I talked to several scientists about this, and one scientist told me that we are actually two species. We have a daytime mode and we have a nighttime mode. In our daytime mode, we have an increase in growth hormone, higher temperature, higher metabolism. In our nighttime mode, all those values decrease. You can think of it as a rest mode. How our body knows what mode to be in, daytime mode, nighttime mode, daytime mode, is dependent on the lights. Now, in order to understand that, we actually have to think about our eye. Most of us know that the eye sees because light hits the retina, And that information goes down the optic nerve to the brain, where it's reconverted into what we know as vision. But what we found out recently, and by recently I mean in the last 3 decades, we found out that the eye actually had a secret thing that we didn't know about. Oh yeah, there's a special photoreceptor on the retina that doesn't contribute to vision. You can think of it as a detector, if you will, and it's on the lookout for blue light. When it sees blue light, that information goes down the optic nerve to the brain, to another part of the brain, which stops secreting melatonin. Melatonin is a chemical compound that lets all the cells know that it's nighttime mode. So when it is shut off, they enter into daytime mode. So in short, blue light, daytime mode. That's how we know. Now, long time ago, when our ancestors were alive, they lived by sunlight, and then they lived by candlelight. Now, the sun has a lot of blue in it, and so they were in daytime mode. And as the sun set, they were under a redder light from the candlelight, and so they were actually entered into nighttime mode. Daytime mode, nighttime mode, which is the healthy way to go. However, all of us live mostly under the glow of artificial lights until we go to sleep. And artificial lights are very, very rich in blue. So we're in growth mode or daytime mode all the time until we turn it. Now you may be asking, what's the big deal? This is what I asked, what's the big deal? Well, if you have cells stimulated with growth hormones, they're going to respond. In fact, the results are already perceivable. Researchers believe that we actually are slightly taller than our ancestors. And one of the reasons is the electric lights. Now, you are probably listing a whole bunch of reasons why that may be the case, such as nutrition, water, medicine, and that's true. But another contributor are the electric lights. So that's one thing. But if you also have your cells swimming in growth hormone, they will respond to that. And sometimes they will respond to that in ways that you don't want. In fact, researchers have done studies on animals and they've subjected them to various types of artificial light. And what they have found is those that had been subjected to artificial light had an increase in certain diseases of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and some forms of cancer. Now, we can't do those studies on humans. We don't do that. That's bad. However, epidemiologists have studied people and what they do for a living and their types of ailments, and they see that there's a certain population of people who succumb to a range of ailments, including some forms of cancer, because of when they work. They work at night underneath the electric lights. Those people who work at times other than 9 to 5, such as surgeons and security guards, are underneath this beam of blue light, which is putting them into a perpetual daytime mode. So the question is, how do we live healthily underneath these electric lights? Edison had created this invention to push back the darkness to lengthen the day. And now we have this unintended consequence where our body responds to this. So how do we live in a healthy way underneath those lights? Well, the answer is simple. It's to go back and do what our ancestors used to do. We need to have bright mornings, dim evenings. We need to have blue light in the morning, and then in the evenings have redder light. So when you wake up, go for a walk. Let that sun hit your eye, put you into daytime mode. If you're unable to go outside, the other thing that you can do is put on some blue LEDs or some compact bulbs, which are rich in the blue, which will also put you into daytime mode. Now, as the sun sets, we actually need to change our lights. We need to dim all those blue lights, and we need to turn on lights that are redder. Incandescent bulbs and red LEDs are redder, and so they'll put us in the necessary nighttime mode. Now, that's not the only thing we need to do. We also need to change our devices. Our devices, they generate a lot of blue light, which puts us in daytime mode. So we need to put them into nighttime mode so that we can enter into nighttime mode. And that's not the only thing. We also need to change our computers and our television screens because they too generate a lot of blue. Now, some fancier models will have a nighttime mode, so you should put them into nighttime mode. But if you don't have that, the other option is to wear those glasses that are out there that block the blue. Some of them are a bit expensive. You could actually go to the hardware store and get some welder's glasses as long as it blocks blue light and enter into that nighttime mode. Sure, you might look a little funny, but at least you're living more, in a more healthy way. So this is the result of an invention having one intention and then having an unintended result because of it. And this is one of the things that I talk about in The Alchemy of Us. Now, what's interesting to me is that the blue LED, from a material science point of view, was a holy grail. You see, blue LEDs were really hard to make from a research point of view. And we really wanted blue LEDs because we had green LEDs, we had red LEDs, and we needed blue LEDs because the three of them together would generate white light so we can have those wonderful billboards. The blue LEDs were so important. In fact, the inventors who made it, they got the Nobel Prize. I'm sure that they didn't know that it had this impact on our health, but now we do. And this is one of the things that I highlight in The Alchemy of Us, that you can have one intention for a design, but sometimes it may be going in the wrong direction, and so we need to pull it back and as we learn more. And this is one of the things that I show in my book. Okay, so we've looked at how technology can give rise to surprises, how there can sometimes be unintended consequences. With a little bit of time that I have with you, I would like to share with you how technology can sometimes go awry. And it can be actually a technology that you love. And a good case study for this is photography. I love photography. And one of my favorite cameras was the one that my grandfather used to have. He had an instant camera made by Polaroid. And many of my childhood memories are captured in that iconic white frame. But what I learned while writing The Alchemy of Us is that while I was standing in front of my grandfather's camera, standing and being happy, there were people who were 8,000 miles away who were in front of an instant camera, and they weren't too happy about it. Let me share with you the story of one of my heroes, Caroline Hunter. Caroline Hunter was a 20-something chemist working at Polaroid in the 1970s. She was going to lunch with her friend Ken Williams, who was in the art department. And as they were leaving his office, they saw a bulletin board, and on it was a mock-up of an identification card, and it said, Department of the Mines, Republic of South Africa. These two looked at each other and they're like, what? What's Polaroid got to do with South Africa? See, they knew that South Africa had an apartheid system. They also knew that the year before, the UN said that all companies in the United States should cease and desist from operating and doing business with South Africa. So they wanted to know, what was Polaroid doing there? Well, they investigated, and this is what they found. They found that the government of South Africa was monitoring and controlling all Black South Africans. Any Black South African above the age of 16 had to carry with them a passbook. The passbook was a 20-page document, and it told officials where a person could go, where they could not go, and where they lived. At the heart of the passbook was a picture made by Polaroid. Caroline and Ken didn't think this was right. They didn't think this was right at all. This technology was buttressing a very oppressive way of living. And so after 7 years of activism, they eventually swayed Polaroid from selling its technology to the apartheid system. They learned that technology can be something that we love, but it must be corralled. And that's one of the things I show in The Alchemy of Us. So in our time together, I hope that you see that it's important to put technology, even old technologies, under the microscope, which is what I do in my book. It's important that we examine these technologies so that we can see if they're going in the right direction. I hope that you have a new posture where you don't want to just embrace technology, but you want to examine it and ask it the question, okay, tech, now that you're in my life, how is my life going to change? And be okay with that answer. It's important to examine technology because, as I say in my final thought of The Alchemy of Us, such a thoughtful analysis about the impact of inventions benefits society, not just because it's an entertaining cerebral exercise, but because when coupled with action and social change, it has the potential to help society transcend its condition and favorably further this alchemy of us. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to all of your questions.
Great, thank you. Very interesting. I have read the book, and it was a few weeks ago, and so I'm glad to have heard your recap of a couple of the stories that I liked. I especially found the Caroline Hunter story to be compelling, so thank you for mentioning that. One of the questions we got was about inventors, and in your experience, did they come from money? Did they self-fund? Was there any kind of uh, trend in, you know, what inspired people to do things, or how they paid for it?
Oh, that's a good question. How did they pay for it? A lot of the inventions that I highlight in the Alchemy of Us, they just seem to come from passion. People see a problem and they want to fix it. There are some people who had means, like William Wallace was very, very well off. He is in charge of the Wallace Manufacturing Company, which was huge in Estonia. Many people worked for that. So he was pretty well off, and he had a huge house, and actually the top floor of his house, he had converted into a laboratory. And it was one of the best laboratories in the world in his house. So he had means. But other people, some of them were just regular everyday people. So I don't really see a particular trend for how well off they were. But in terms of their desire to work, it really came from passion. There was one gentleman, Henry Bessemer, he wanted money. But most other people, they really wanted to just solve a problem.
Great. Just a quick question. Do you have any information about what humans historically did between first sleep and second sleep?
Oh, well, yeah, there's a great book by Roger E. Kirch, and I talk about it in my book. But for that hour or so, people would they would eat, they would read, they would go visit their neighbors because their neighbors were up. It was, it was actually something that people really treasured. They would do things with their family. It was a special time. Now, when we wake up in the middle of the night, we feel like we have some kind of medical condition, but they actually savored it. They're like, oh, it's our halftime. And then they would go back to bed. So it was actually, it's pretty well documented. And I do talk about it in detail in the book.
There are a couple of questions about your predictions for some future inventions or current things that will have future consequences. You obviously talked about phones and lights and that sort of thing, but any thoughts about maybe 3D printing or graphene or something along those lines?
Oh, those are good questions. Well, I think that we should be asking those questions. And that's the reason why I wrote The Alchemy of Us. Scientists, and I'm a scientist, we build things and we don't really think about the repercussions. We want to get the best material out there. So sometimes we don't consider if it's sustainable. We try and do things very rapidly. And so we don't think about how to design a pathway so that it can be inclusive. There's a lot of questions that we don't ask. And so the reason why I wrote The Alchemy of Us is so that we can start asking those questions. And specifically for graphene and 3D printing, they still need to do studies about the toxicity of graphene because it's it's on a nanoscale. So if I would pull one of my hairs and whittle it 100,000 times, that's the thickness of graphene. People haven't done a lot of studies to see how it interacts with the body. So those kinds of things need to be thought of while people are working on great devices. Someone also should be thinking about what are the impacts, and those studies are fewer and far between.
I imagine that it's hard to predict what those things are going to be. Like, who would know, or who would kind of think that a light bulb is going to change the life cycle of a firefly? I mean, I guess maybe.
Right. But that's what I'm saying. It's like, it's really hard to protect, but we should be doing that exercise. I can speculate, but what I'm more interested in is encouraging people to ask the question. And so I'm pleased with the question. I'm sorry that I don't have the answer, but I think it's something that we should be asking.
Definitely. A couple of questions. Let's see. Hold on. Well, we talked about this before when we did our short interview on the podcast, but were there stories that you wanted to add to the book that you couldn't fit in for some reason?
Oh, yeah. Well, one story, for some reason, I love the Telegraph. It's a simple device, but it really shaped us in a lot of ways. It changed language. It changed how we consume news. And I found a story that completely blew me away, but it didn't make the book. It ends up that Lincoln wanted to ensure that the 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery, happened. And what he needed was votes. And so it didn't look like he had the votes. And so what he did is he looked at the map and he looked at Nevada, and Nevada was a territory. He's like, okay, I'm going to make you a state. If I make you a state, your senator and your representative will vote for my amendment. So Nevada needed to be, in order for Nevada to become a state, it had to get its state constitution to Lincoln. And they had not much time. So they sent the message through two routes. They went to San Francisco and then took a boat across and then up to DC. So they had to cross the Panama. Panama Canal didn't exist, so they had to actually take a mule across. The other way was the overland stagecoach. It ends up that the messages didn't make it. The state constitution didn't make it. So what did Nevada do? They sent it by telegram. And it was over 16,000 words were sent to Lincoln so that the state constitution could get there on time. I love this story. It did not make the book. I actually wrote an article about it in Time magazine. But so yeah, there's great stories like that that ended up on the cutting room floor.
One of the things that I really appreciate about this book is that you featured women and people of color who are often overlooked in other stories. You talked about Ruth, the woman who sold time, and Caroline Hunter. I keep having to look at my note on her name. Are there other people in the book who you want to just do a quick highlight about?
Well, the other woman that I really was so happy to uncover was Bessie Littleton. She came up with the idea for something that you have in your house. If you've been baking cookies or whatever while we've been kept at home, she's the one who came up with the idea of the Pyrex dish. And so the story is that her husband worked at Corning. She came home and she had just broken a very expensive vase. And she's like, you smart Alex, you keep talking about this wonderful glass that you made, but I just broke my dish. Can you make something that won't break? And so he came home with a dish and she made a cake in it. And it was lovely. And when he brought it to work, this cake that she had made, they thought it was fantastic. And he's like, oh, by the way, this was cooked in glass. Now, I'm sure that all the people who were there, if they had food in their mouth, it dropped out because no one thought that putting glass into an oven was a good idea. But because they had made this special type of glass called borosilicate glass, it actually functioned well in hot environments like an oven and cooked actually better than a metal pan. So Bessie came up with the idea for Pyrex dishes, and I was just happy to elevate her because she's often a footnote, just like William Wallace and Ruth Belville. So I was glad that she got her moment in the sun.
I'm glad of that as well. One more question. As a materials scientist, what do you find to be the most intriguing topic today?
Oh man, well, there's so many. It's like children. You can't say, oh, that's my favorite, even though you have a favorite. But it's not my field, but I'm really geeked about biomaterials. I keep hearing how they're making organs in a dish, like they've grown ears, they're working on livers. So I just find that fascinating. And I work with metals, and metals are very they're formed, and they're crazy, but they're not that crazy. But squishy stuff, that's really hard to make. And that's the future. So I'm kind of excited about the things I read about biomaterials right now.
There's no way that growing things in petri dishes are, human body parts are going to go badly or anything like that, right? There's no movie.
Well, that's the reason. I'm so glad you said. So we need people to be asking questions about that. From a scientific point of view, because this is what scientists are doing. They're like, oh, that's really cool. But no one's asking, is that a good idea? And that's why the Alchemy of Us was written, so that you can start saying, is that a good idea? So you can push these scientists, because they think with one-track mind. We need to corral them.
Well, great. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation and for answering questions. And we're going to wrap up here, but thank you for joining us. And I'm going to share my screen again, and hopefully, let's see. And just remind everybody that The Alchemy of Us, How Humans and Matter Transformed One Another by Dr. Aneesa Ramirez, who you've just been speaking, it is available, and it's also available on audiobook if that is a thing that appeals to you. So I recommend that you pick it up. I likened it to A Short History of Nearly Everything. I don't know if any of you enjoyed that book by Bill Bryson. Smaller in scope, but much deeper in specific areas. I really enjoyed this book a lot, so I recommend it. Just a quick note, speaking of books, we are going to be having another author, another scientist on screen next week. We are going to be having Kevin Peter Hand, I have his book as well, on Alien Oceans, The Search for Life in the Depths of Space. And he is a scientist at NASA who is doing work on several of the moons in our solar system, looking for life at the bottom of possible oceans. It's a really fascinating story. If you're interested, again, we have a short interview with him on our podcast, which is called A Scientist Walks into a Bar. And I think it was the episode a couple weeks ago. Anyway, you can hear me talking to Kevin about the book, and he will be back next week on May 28th at 7 p.m. Pacific to talk about Alien Oceans. We hope you will join us for that. Wanted to say a quick thank you to our Patreon supporters. The Patreon keeps growing beyond all of our expectations, so thank you for that. If you have already supported us on Patreon, excuse me, sorry. If you've already supported us on Patreon and I don't already have your address and you're expecting me to send you, say, a pint glass or one of our stickers, we have these really cool science stickers. You can have them for Washington as well. Please give me your physical mailing address and I will send those out in the mail to you immediately. So, but thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. You are fabulous people. And if you would like to join us on Patreon, we have a link there at the bottom, or you can, if you are in a position to do so, we would greatly appreciate any donation you're able to make. We couldn't do this without you. We are working with our nonprofit partner, Make You Think, and you can go to makeyoutthink.org/support, and you can donate. I think it's through a PayPal link, and it's pretty simple, and that helps us keep going. So I appreciate your help, and we hope that you enjoyed this presentation this evening, and go check out the book and join us next week to find out about Alien Oceans. And stay safe and have a good evening.
Thank you.